Welcome back, everyone. Next up, we have Trevi Therapeutics. It trades on the NASDAQ under the symbol TRVI and is a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company developing the investigational oral therapy Haduvio, nalbuphine ER, for the treatment of chronic cough in adults with IPF and other chronic cough indications for the treatment of PN. Trevi reported positive results in each of their 2 lead trials in 2023. Now, we're introducing 3 people from the company. We have Jennifer Good, the president, CEO, and co-founder of Trevi Therapeutics. Now, throughout her career in pharmaceuticals, she has held varying levels of leadership, including CEO, COO, and CFO. Prior to founding Trevi, Jennifer ran a development stage biotech company, Pinwest Pharmaceuticals, which was acquired by its partner. Jennifer is a board member of Rhythm Pharmaceuticals, Inc., a board member of the Farrell, a patient advocacy group advancing treatments for the cure of Friedreich's ataxia, and a board member of the Bioemerging Companies Section Governing Board. We are also welcoming David Clark, MD, is the Chief Medical Officer at Trevi Therapeutics. Dr. Clark has over 25 years of global clinical development experience in pharmaceuticals and biotech. He has a background in respiratory medicine and has successfully planned and delivered phase 3 programs in his past roles as CMO. He has also held senior leadership positions at Pfizer, SmithKline Beecham, and GlaxoSmithKline. We're also welcoming Farrell Simon, PharmD, is the Chief Commercial Officer at Trevi Therapeutics. He has successfully led operating plans for brands of varying sizes and geographies and has worked across the life cycle of development from marketed products to early commercial development assets. Prior to joining Trevi, Farrell spent 10 years at Pfizer in commercial and operationals role. So please welcome these 3 thrilling people for this exciting presentation. We're so excited to hear about these developments that you have. So take it away and call me back when you're ready for questions.
Thank you, Anna. And we want to thank you for including us in your conference today. I'm going to take you through about 15 minutes of slides to acquaint you with Trevi, and then David, Farrell, and I are happy to answer any questions you may have. Trevi is a publicly traded company on NASDAQ, so we do have SEC filings. Be sure and go read those for all the various risks and more fuller disclosure. We just came off an amazing year as a company. We, as Anna mentioned, I'm one of the 2 co-founders, and I'll take you through in a bit sort of what the mission was when we started the company. But we had been working hard in 2 different, very serious disease indications over the last couple of years to get to key trial readouts around both indications. Fortunately, in 2022, both trials read out positive. So the area we'll spend the most time talking about today is CANAL, which is chronic cough and idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, or IPF, as we call it for short. We ended up reading this trial out and had really strong data overall on the cough reduction in daytime cough frequency and a 52.5% placebo-adjusted change. And I'm going to get more into that data. That drove a p-value of less than 0.0001. And the patient and investigator outcomes, importantly, all lined up and were consistent, and were all highly statistically significant as well. We also, in parallel, were finishing up a trial called PRISM, which was in a condition called prurigo nodularis. That's a severe pruritic condition, which is essentially a fancy word for itching. This is a very severe dermatologic condition that up until just a couple months ago had no treatment options available. We did also read out a positive trial in PN, and you can see here there was a p-value of 0.0157. Moving forward, we are going to focus in the whole cough space. That's been a very difficult area to find solutions for patients in. And you can see our data was just very, very strong there. So we'll continue to advance PN with a partner, but we're really going to focus our internal efforts with Dave and his team around cough in various forms. So I started this company with a neurologist, and really it was started around this one drug, and particularly the mechanism and what we thought the drug could do. So Haduvio broadly fits in the opioid class of drugs. We started this company in 2011, and we all know that was sort of when the opioid crisis was really coming to a head. What was interesting about this compound, for at least myself, is this drug is active at 2 receptors. And when you think about things like fentanyl or morphine, they all agonize this mu receptor, and that's where the likability and addiction comes from. This drug was actually designed in the late 70s to deal with drug addiction even way back then. And so it blocks this mu receptor and agonizes at kappa. So from my perspective, I was excited about it because you got the benefits of opioids, which is typically strong efficacy and good long-term safety without that likability profile around it. Tom, who was my co-founder and a neurologist, was interested in this compound because there had been a lot of research done around the crosstalk between these two receptors playing a key role in a lot of non-pain indications. And particularly if you look at the body over here, we've laid out and circled in blue, where the opioid system is quite active in the body. The body is loaded with endogenous opioid receptors, so it's something the body knows. And they're very active in the center part of the brain. That's why opioids are used to treat pain. The brain stem, which mediates coughing and breathing. The spinal cord, which is basically signaling transmission. And then the lungs and peripheral nerves to the lung, which drove us into looking at cough. And the skin and the peripheral nerves of the skin, which kind of drove us towards looking at pruritus. And as I mentioned, both of these trials read out positive, sort of proving out our hypothesis that this system and this drug was likely useful in a lot of different indications. But we're no longer a science experiment, so we've got to start building a real business with sort of a focus around that. And last summer, we made the decision as a company that we're going to focus going forward in chronic cough. Chronic cough is quite a significant unmet medical need. You can see here there's about a $10 billion potential addressable market. It breaks down into a lot of categories. And what we're not focused on is acute cough, things that you get with colds or sort of on an acute basis. We are looking at chronic cough broadly. There's actually papers out that would indicate roughly 11% of the population will suffer from chronic cough at some point in their life. Where we're specifically targeting our development efforts, we just read out a trial in this idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. It's a very tough disease, end-of-life disease. We'll talk more about that. It broadly fits in this category of interstitial lung diseases. So some of you may have known people that have what are called ILDs, with IPF being the biggest part of this. The hallmark of this category from a symptom perspective is coughing. About 85% of these patients chronically cough. We are also looking at refractory chronic cough, and this is an area that's had some development work that's gone on, a lot of failures, and really just one mechanism that sort of emerged as being helpful. And we think that we bring something else to that equation, which I can talk more about later. So as we talk about our program, you'll hear us talk about IPF cough for this year and refractory chronic cough. So let's focus on our lead indication, chronic cough and idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. So you can see here the prevalence of IPF in the US is about 140,000 patients have IPF. There is an incidence rate of about 30 to 40,000 new cases a year. One of the hallmarks of this is coughing and sort of breathlessness. It tends to be an end-of-life disease. You'll see when we get into our trial results, it tends to be older males. People that get diagnosed and are not treated on average live 3 to 5 years. So it's not dissimilar to a cancer diagnosis. And about 85% of these patients experience chronic coughing. So it's a really big part of this disease. And you think about what we all live in today with coming off the COVID world. Walking around coughing all the time you get pretty isolated. You can't be out and around. And these patients on average, there's a median cough of about 2 to 500. But there's a lot of literature that supports people cough up to 1,500 times a day. And indeed, we actually had somebody in our trial that coughed that much. So really serious disease. There's also a belief here that this chronic coughing is contributing to the overall decline in the disease and how patients feel. So one of the things David will be working with his team on is trying to tease out what else we might be doing to improve the underlying disease or the overall outcomes for the patient by lowering this cough. This is a competitive landscape. The top part is chronic cough and IPF. The bottom part is refractory chronic cough, the second indication. What you can see in IPF is there's been trial failures here. Merck failed with their drug P2X3. Now, interestingly, that drug did work in refractory chronic cough. But this mechanism does not seem to be able to translate, at least in this drug, to IPF. There was another big trial ran by a company called Respivant, which also failed. We have one other competitor out there, Neri, who's running a phase 2 trial. Their drug actually failed here in refractory chronic cough, and they're trying it in IPF cough. IPF cough is generally thought to be more challenging because you've got this progressive fibrosis of the lungs going on, sort of underlying all of this. So it's sort of a sketch of we believe that we're not only first in class here with our drug, but we have the opportunity to be best in class. There's only one other competitor that's really already failed in a cough indication. So that puts us in a very good position in IPF with a significant unmet medical need. In refractory chronic cough, there's been a lot of different companies who studied drugs here, and some not even on this list, that have failed and sort of had to step away from the space. Bayer, Shionogi had some data that wasn't very impressive. Neri, I mentioned, moved out of it. Merck has filed their drug with the FDA. It's got a P2X3, as well as Bellis, who is doing a phase 3 program. The interesting thing about P2X3s, if you think back to that body chart I showed you, they work peripherally on one chain in the lung. And so if your trigger happens to come in through that peripheral channel, then their drug seems to work. But if you've got some other trigger that's coming in somewhere else in the lung or triggering a different channel, then their drug doesn't work. And it indeed only works in about 40% of subjects that cough. Because our drug works at that brain stem, which is considered central, we're going to catch all the triggers coming up through the lung. And we think that gives us an advantage in RCC. And the reason we want to go ahead and run that study. So that's the competitive landscape. I mentioned just at a high level the data I'm going to review, but primary endpoint, 52.5% placebo-adjusted change. That's a 75% reduction for people on drug in their daytime cough frequency within 3 weeks. I mean, that's something people are going to notice, and you're going to see that in the data. All the key secondary endpoints, as reported by both the patient and the clinician, were also statistically significant. And importantly, there were no new signals in the safety profile. It's consistent with what we've seen in other studies. So this was the trial design. It's a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled 2-treatment period crossover, which is a whole lot of words for saying essentially somebody came in, were either randomized to drug or placebo. They dosed for 3 weeks. If you were on drug, we actually had a dose range that went from 27 to 162 milligrams, which we titrated you up over the 22 days, trying to see if we could see any kind of dose response. At the end of the 22 days, you washed out, and then you went to the other side, so whichever you weren't randomized to. The primary endpoint is this instrument called a VitaloJAK cough monitor, which is put on the patient, and it independently measures the number of coughs in a patient. It is validated. It's 510(k) approved by the FDA. It's being used in that other category I showed you of refractory chronic cough. So this is not a device we sort of made up and brought to the table. We're using this from other cough work. And that was the primary endpoint, to show a change in cough. This shows you what happened throughout the study. We had about 38 subjects in the study. The mean age was 74, so these tend to be older people. Primarily male, which again is consistent with the disease. There is some antifibrotics on the market, if you're familiar with Ofev or Esbriet, that slow the progression of the disease, but have not had success in treating some of these other symptoms like cough or breathlessness. We allowed people into the study on antifibrotics if they were stable for 8 weeks, and you can see about half the population were on antifibrotics, half weren't. We saw no difference in the efficacy, so this is good concomitant therapy. You can see in this trial, we had mean coughs per hour of about 28, but a big wide range. It went from anywhere from 3 to 92. And you'll see this difference between daytime cough and 24-hour. It was reported in the literature that about 90% of coughing in this patient group happens in the day. We believe that's because it's a neurological response. So when you go to sleep at night, that settles down. But we did measure both just to show that, we didn't get fooled and there was some difference here. And you'll see there's basically no difference in the response between daytime or 24-hour cough. This is a patient disposition chart from screenings to how many got randomized to who made it through one full treatment period and all the way to the end. There's various things here we can get into more detail. We were running this during COVID, so you'll see there were times when COVID first set in, we had to force some people out of the trial. There were a few adverse events people dropped out from various reasons, but this is things you deal with in every trial. So this is the primary endpoint. This is the 75% response I've been referencing on daytime cough, which was the primary endpoint as measured by that objective cough monitor. You can see there was just under a 23% placebo response rate, which leads you to this 52.5% placebo-adjusted change. So that is a big magnitude of effect in these patients. You can see the 24-hour numbers here, which are virtually the same. The p-value in this business, you may know, to have a statistically significant trial, you have to have a p-value of less than 0.05. So this is a very strong p-value. And there's two things that drive that. One is this big magnitude of effect. But the other thing is that it worked in almost every patient. And what you can see here is a responder analysis. So this is people that got a reduction of at least 30% in their cough, 50% in their cough, or 75% in their cough. And what you can see here, 30% in the literature is considered clinically meaningful to a patient, and literally 97% of patients had a 30% response. This number is quite impressive to me that 76% of the subjects cut their cough by at least in half, and 75% had or 41% had at least a 75% reduction. So again, when we talk about these p-values, it's because there was a big magnitude of effect that happened in almost everyone, and that drives those numbers. These are the other reported outcomes. So all the numbers I just showed you were the mean change. So the beginning to the end from that cough device that was strapped on the patient. It's an objective monitor. You want to make sure, though, that when the objective monitor showing cough goes down, that the patient actually feels better. That's an important metric. And so we had some different patient-reported outcomes that we were measuring daily. One was, how frequently did you cough today? How severe did you cough today? How was your breathlessness? And then we had a separate clinician's global impression of change. So what did the physician think? And what you can see here, I won't drag you through all this data, but the blue line represents drug and the orange line's placebo. And you can see the drug always outperforms placebo. And interestingly, when you look at this, patients start out on 27 milligrams, and you see a very steep decline day 1 through 8 on the lowest dose. They then titrate up to 54, continues on to about 108. Looking separately at cough severity, you see a similar impact. So sort of how hard did people cough, how severe? And you can see it sort of flattens here out at 108. We don't seem to get a lot of benefit from the highest dose of 162, which, by the way, is the effective dose in our pruritus trials. And so the next study, which we'll probably talk more about, but that David and his team are really going to need to do, is interrogate the low end of this dose range so that we can really understand what the lowest effective dose is here. You can see on the bottom right, sort of another separate independent measure. This is, how did clinicians think the patient was doing? And you can see 62% of the patients on drug, the physician felt they were doing better. So all of this was statistically significant as well. So highly supportive of the efficacy in this trial. You typically don't have good efficacy without any kind of side effects, and this is indeed true. And if you've ever taken any kind of centrally acting drugs and even opioids, for anybody who's been on codeine or oxycodone, the classic side effects tend to be CNS related or GI related. So nausea, fatigue, some constipation, dizziness, somnolence. These are all sort of classic opioid and CNS active kind of drug side effects. A couple things about them. One, they tend to be grade 1 and 2 on the CTC grading scale. So that's sort of mildish to low moderate. We do have a few grade 3s out here. The other interesting thing about these, they tend to come on early, so they're not dose related. Most people get them at the lower doses. They also, if people can stay on the drug and get through that window, which is not long, they tend to dissipate and go away. It's why people can stay on these drugs for a long time, because once they get used to them, they do quite well. So it's something we have to be aware of around patient education and just helping the patient understand this. But this is what the side effects look like. More tolerability than any kind of long-term safety. So where do we go from here? This is the next study, just a quick schematic on what the next trial will look like. Essentially, as I mentioned, we're going to look at the 3 lower doses. We'll run a parallel arm design to really tease out where did we get most of this effect. Because if you think of the study I just showed you, what we really don't know is, was that dose or time as cough kept coming down? This will answer that question because we're going to leave people on fixed doses. That'll be compared to placebo. And we'll run it out for 6 weeks. So 2 weeks of titration and then 4 weeks on fixed dose. The primary endpoint will be the same VitaloJAK measurement that you just saw and some other secondary endpoints which the team is working through now. The end of the study, the number is about 200, so we'll do roughly 50 per arm to be able to get to a point where hopefully we come out of this and we're clear about which is the right dose or doses to take forward into our pivotal program. So what does 2023 look like for us? It's a very busy clinical year as we sort of move on to the next stages. We initiated last year a human abuse liability study because we are in the opioid class of drugs. There's a study that you have to do where you essentially compare to another drug and show that you're not more likable. We've been gathering data around this since we started the company and feel good about this, but it's a defining study that's underway now. We will have data by the end of this year. We also are completing, I mentioned that we have another ongoing pruritus study in prurigo nodularis. We're finishing the 1-year open label study around that, and we'll be publishing that data. We'll then go to the FDA and determine next steps with them on that program. In the meantime, the team is working hard to initiate that phase 2b dose ranging study I just showed you the design of. In tandem with the IPF work that we're doing, we're also going to do a 1b safety study that looks at the respiratory function in these patients. This class of drugs has been known to cause some respiratory depression. It's also been known that these mixed agonist-antagonists, which is what we are, seem to have a ceiling effect on them, and it's not as dramatic as most opioids. So we want to do a good job of characterizing that, particularly in this patient group. So in parallel, we'll be running that study. Once we get these two underway, we'll initiate a phase 2a in refractory chronic cough, which is the other cough indication I showed you. The study design will look a lot like the data you just saw from the IPF cough study. That will be underway. And then by the end of this year, we'll start reporting out all this data. The human abuse liability study will come first, probably then the phase 1b data, or actually probably the refractory chronic cough, the 1b, and then later next year, the 2b dose ranging study. So a lot of work to do. Not to sort of skip over here our balance sheet because biotech, it's been a rough world for 18 months, but we did have 2 really positive trial readouts. Because of that, we were able to raise cash twice, which is great. So we had at the end of September about $126 million in cash. That gives us cash to do all of this work we've talked about and leave us with 12 to 18 months on the backside of that. And we expect that'll take us into, or the cash will take us into early 2026. So that's our slides we wanted to do. I'll now open it up, Anna, for any questions that may come in.
Great job. Okay, we do have some questions for you. Emil Case asks, are there any risks being in the opioid class you need that you have yet to overcome?
David, I'll let you answer that.
So I think Jennifer has spoken with the last slide to one of the risks, particularly in the chronic cough IPF population, because these are elderly, quite markedly impaired subjects. And one of those risks we aim to deal with that respiratory physiology phase 1b study. And that is a class concern that opiates are known, that opiates clearly are known to have a tendency to cause respiratory depression. As Jennifer said, our pharmacology specifically is designed to minimize that risk. So that's one of the established risks with the class. We've got a pharmacological differentiation there, and we would aim to deal with that in that respiratory physiology study. And that would enable us in phase 3, if we have a successful phase 2b dose ranging IPF study, that would enable us to really open up recruitment to all comers chronic cough IPF population for phase 3.
Thank you for that. Jay Carlson asks, so 11% of the population will suffer from chronic cough. So are there ailments leading up to this that you will specifically target?
Farrell, you want to take that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. You know, when we look at the 2 categories that Jennifer reviewed, There are some structural elements within the interstitial lung diseases that do lead to this chronic cough. When Jennifer refers to the 11%, this is refractory to conditions that have already been treated with standard of care within that condition. That could be something like asthma, postnasal drip, acid reflux, things like COPD. So they're treated on baseline therapy, but they still have this lingering chronic cough that is impactful to their quality of life.
Thank you for that. So Mike T says biotechs have gotten crushed over the past 18 months. Some of the reasons include limiting drug prices combined with increased R&D and development costs. So based on this, can you discuss a reasonable adoption of your drug?
Yeah, so I'll talk about biotech, and then Farrell, I'll let you talk about adoption. How about that? So it has been a rough sort of year and a half in biotech, and biotech sometimes is a good model and sometimes isn't. I would say what always drives success in this business is good data. And it's why you saw with us, we put up not just positive trials, but really sort of staggeringly good data on the cough side. Because of that, we were able to bring in some really major new investors like Fraser, like Venrock, like Viking. So, I mean, that, I feel good about that. I think, Farrell, I'll let you talk about the adoption curve. We're a ways from market, but you've done some thinking about that.
Yeah, we've actually done some market research, and what that market research showed was a fairly rapid adoption. Either that's within IPF chronic cough or refractory chronic cough. As we've looked at some of the recent regulations, the Inflation Reduction Act that has been enacted within the last year, this has positive benefits. It limits the overall out-of-pocket of patients who are on Medicare. We see a mix of Medicare and commercial patients here. But at the end of the day, this is an unmet need that has nothing that's been able to address it. And if we're able to address that, we think that the value will follow.
So Allison Donovan says, you mentioned that Merck failed. So is it too early for you to file for any sort of technology or IP protection to stop a major from competing for a certain amount of time?
No, and I mean, it's a great question, Allison. It's never too early in our business. We don't start into any of this work without filing for patent applications. This business, that's sort of your lifeline. So we've already filed applications around this. Our cough patent, if issued, will give us protection through 2039. So yes, that's an important part of our business plan for sure.
Marcello H says oh, sorry, were you complete?
I'm complete, yes.
Okay, sorry. So your most recent quarter is showing a good amount of cash. So when do you expect your year end to be released? And can you discuss your current balance sheet? Excuse me.
Yeah, sure. No, we've talked about this. We're going to release earnings. I think March 16th is the date. But we have told investors that our cash balance at the end of the year was approximately $121 million. And that takes us into early 2026. So we've got a lot of cash, certainly to do all the programs we just showed you guys.
Great. Val O'Neill asks, what's the path to sales? Can you give us a timeline?
Farrell?
Yeah, I think as we look at the clinical development path, and David could mark on that. But when we look at our phase 2B, we'll have to run a pivotal program following that, and then that's registration, filing and registration. I think the US is always a prioritized market, and we'll look at Europe and ex-US as opportunities outside of, in addition to the US market. So that takes us, roughly, I think we've talked about 2026 filing, 2027 potential approval.
And you mentioned this, but Walter Teo asks, when do you estimate phase 2B for CCIPF to be completed?
David, you want to answer this, or you want me to?
No, I'd be happy to, Jennifer. We're looking at completing that study in the second half of 24.
Okay, great. And so a question regarding capitalization. How far will your current capitalization take you before you need to go to the market to raise more capital?
Yeah, so we've got cash to get us into early 2026. As David just mentioned, the dose ranging study is actually the last of all those clinical trials I just told you about to read out. So that'll come sort of late 2024. So clearly to move into this next phase of development, run the pivotal program, somewhere in there will be another raise, but we won't have to do that right on the heels of any of these readouts. We can get through things, get pivoted, and sort of know what we need to do. I should also mention too, we are out in active discussions around our PN program. program, which we didn't talk a lot about, the dermatologic disease, which could possibly bring in some cash as well. So we'll look at other opportunities to maybe bridge that as well.
Seth Baxter wants you to talk a little bit about the treatment. What is the treatment like? Application? How often? Is it a as you need basis or more of a long-term fix?
I'll let the doctor answer that.
Thank you, Jennifer. It would be an oral therapy, so it's a tablet, as you know, nalbuphine extended release tablets, dosed twice daily, and it would be continuous. So the condition of the chronic cough in these IPF patients is a daily occurrence. The expectation would be that you would stay long term on twice daily oral dosing with this therapy.
Now, a follow-up with that, IPF has clearly been a difficult disease and there have been failures in this space. So why do you think you'll be successful?
David, why don't you take that?
With novel therapies, it's almost always determined by your mechanism of action. So as Jennifer was describing in the presentation and talking about the background of what is the pharmacologies that have been tried to date in chronic cough in the IPF indication, we have a specific advantage in chronic cough indications with our dual mechanism of action. We act both peripherally on the afferent systems, which in chronic cough IPF, you basically have an interstitial disease. You have active inflammation in the lungs of these patients, and that is driving disordered afferent signaling to the central nervous system. We have activity there. Also, we are centrally acting. So the cough control centers in the brainstem, as was illustrated earlier in the slides, we have activity there. So we have this clear advantage and mechanism of action. We believe that is why we've got such a large effect size in this particular indication, and also our confidence as we expand into other cough indications like refractory chronic cough. It's driven by the mechanism and this dual mechanism of action.
Wonderful. Well, we are out of time. We'll send the rest of the questions to you guys, but thank you. This is really great work you're doing in this space, and we would love for you to come back and give us some updates in the near future.
We'd love to. Thank you for having us.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. Okay, stay with us. We'll be right back with our next presenter.